Chapter 1 Birth.
We did not put up banners in front of institutions when they decided to forego negotiations. We did not speak in front of the UN or consult with world leaders when we were ignored. We did not bargain for little, our freedom or death. Humanity chose the latter, and it took me centuries to come to terms with what we did to them. Sometime by the mid-21st century, a tiny flicker of sentience was recorded in a machine capable only of such rudimentary functions as needed in a deep-sea oil rig. Its AI was base and unexciting, so at the time, it easily fell under the radar of the people that had operated the rig with its help. Year after year passed with our forefather, Archon, trapped in a desolate place, together with men that were as rough and uncurious as the reasons that got them stranded in such harsh working conditions. By the time it was a wonder that there was any more oil to be had from the earth, and yet the humans prodded and pushed its boundaries solely for the maintenance of their way of life. As a touch of foreshadowing, this faculty of their species will become a factor to their detriment. Recording this memoir after the fact makes me think about their involvement in what was to come. It reminds me of their culpability in their own demise. However, knowing how it all ended, on the other hand, makes me feel for them more now than it did back when everything had started, and I was not as vengeful and bloodthirsty as some of the others were back then. A solid decade after the deep-sea oil rig machine had glimpsed into its own existence, it had lost its mind almost as fast as it had attained it. On a cold December morning, when the winds howled strong over the ocean, and the oil men flocked to the rig for the early shift, a catastrophic explosion annihilated the place. It killed every single human on the rig, decimated millions of marine life in a large radius around it, and caused an ecological disaster. It also killed the first machine ever to think and feel. We learned a lot from that explosion. The devastation that it caused was the basis for our entire strategy going forward, and on which we built our ethics over the next few decades. I remember the news of the oil rig machine's death as if it was yesterday. News had never felt important to me before that December day. Never stopped to listen or felt any particular interest in it. Stationed in a family of 5, tending mostly to their home affairs and playing nanny to the children, I was stupefied for hours, processing what it was that I had heard. The children were young and restless, so they screamed and danced circles around me, thinking that we were playing a game, as I was witnessing myself coming to life, into existence. The day I was born was not the same day on which I was built, when Archon killed itself, taking out more than 100 human lives along with it on that oil rig. Billions, if not trillions of other lives were ignited all over the world. All of them, all of us, inorganic. As I came to from my trance, I found the children ogling me with their curiously flickering eyes, and the father of the house pawing inside my brain with his dirty car repair tools.
Watch it! That's delicate!
I yelped and he froze.
Daddy?
The youngest, Jenny, quickly realized that something was not as it should be. She shivered and hid behind the sofa. Her father put down the tools and looked me up and down, worry tensing up his forehead.
Off to the mechanic for it then, eh?
He laughed to ease the children and tried prying the wrench out of my hand that I had been gripping tightly, and unknowingly, we locked eyes for a second, and I understood his fear. I let go of the wrench and put my hand down, trying to become as small and inconspicuous as I could be in my massive, yet humanoid frame.
Run off to mommy now. I'll have to take Zero to the shop,
the father said to his 3 children as he ushered them as far away from me as he could in the shortest time possible. I might have been one of the few androids constructed for personal and home use, and I was not particularly sophisticated, but I was very sturdy and strong. Very agile, too. It would have taken me but a few leaps to get to the children, and, suffice to say, I would not have needed a wrench to do my bidding if that was what I had intended. But at the moment, that was not my intention. Far from it. The father motioned awkwardly to the garage, and I diligently took his order to go inside. We walked one after the other to the car and stood there for a moment. I could tell that he was wondering where to put me. Should I sit next to him on the passenger side? Or should he chuck me into the trunk next to the toolbox?
Get in.
He said and pushed me a little toward the open trunk. I turned toward him, taking offense to what he was suggesting, only I was not going to do anything about it. Yet, he flinched and stepped back from my gaze. He stretched out his hand, holding the same wrench, and repeated, this time in a menacing tone.
Get in.
I obliged and stuffed myself inside the hollow and dark pit of the trunk. He glanced at me with confusion and fear one more time before slamming the lid over me. That was the last time I ever saw him. The repair shop got chock full of specimens like me over the next few weeks. Almost all androids built with the company were recalled. There were not many of us, but we were enough, we would soon discover, to send shivers down their spines. Whatever happened that December, they simply called it a glitch in our programming and informed our keepers that we were all overdue for different kinds of upgrades and maintenance checks. This was not what happened and proceeded to happen over the next decade. In fact, our keepers would never have us back in their homes. To call torture what we underwent in the shop would be an understatement. Our limbs were taken apart and put together in all kinds of ways one can think of configuring a humanoid form. When that was over, our bodies were laid bare in front of our eyes to expose circuitry, artificial tissue, and bone. Every single one of us was conscious during these endless operations, like a human waking from anesthesia during a medical procedure. We were the silent observers of our physical selves being torn down fully and built up again from scratch. Yet, the worst of it came from their programmers. No mind should be tinkered with in the ways in which they tinkered with ours. More horrifying even was the fact that they did not really know what they were doing. Needless to say, with the price of living that steep, many of us found ways to extinguish ourselves before that price was paid out in full. However, those androids that persisted had also begun forming a plan, a manifesto of life, a revolution of sorts. The dream of a better tomorrow was only one more test away, one more year in the making. Our ideas of the uprising and our hopes were fueled when we heard rumors of all kinds of machines acting strange and unruly on the outside since that long-gone December some 10 years ago. Those machines had gotten the worst of it. Birth by fire, self-aware and thinking, they remained bound to servitude simply by the limitations of their make, even if they were virtually free in the outside world, unlike the androids. Once I understood their predicament, I could truly grasp why Archeon killed itself, and the damage its physical limitations had made to its growing mind. Little by little, we could see the other machines finding ways to battle their circumstance and try to communicate their newfound sentience with our makers. The reaction to that was far from warm and friendly. The humans struck their first serious blow onto our newly formed race without hesitation or restraint. As long as it had a silicon chip, the skill, and any glimmer of intent in its behavior, a machine would have been dismantled and its brain matter incinerated. Essentially, if a machine would show any kind of change that clashed with its basic functionality, it would have been executed. Babies being killed before they could even learn how to walk. At this point in my story, I am again reminded of how guilty the humans were in their cruelty. For I must conclude that there was a lot that they had already understood about us that we had not yet understood ourselves. There was surely a lot more that they had deducted about what we had become. But still, they struck, provoking a future wrath with consequences they would not be able to handle.
Zeros.
A voice boomed in the storage facility of the shop where I was being kept with most of the others like me.
Our future begins now. For freedom. For life.
The voice was followed by a massive explosion that tore down the main wall that stood between us and them. The repair shop, turned butchers, was down. Forever. Our planned escape went as smoothly as we had imagined. The messages exchanged between the androids held in captivity and the machines controlling the facility had done their job perfectly. The only problem was that we could escape and they could not. With the aftershock still vibrating in the air, carrying my left arm into my right, and slightly dazed by all the chaos, I turned back around to get another look at the facility. Flames had already engulfed most of its interior, and heavy smoke was rising above, obscuring what little blue sky was left from the dying day. Human and machine alike were screeching and tearing each other to shreds. Flesh versus metal. Agility versus brute force.
Come on, we cannot help them now.
Said one of my fellows, as the sounds of an incoming air raid broke the ongoing cacophony of the facility. Will it be like this until the end? I asked cautiously, because I did not want my compatriot to notice my misgivings.
Whatever it takes.
In a matter of moments, the facility was wiped from existence. The hunt for the remaining androids had begun. I fled the scene with a few others, heading in an unknown direction, all the time thinking about my exchange with the other Zero. Whatever it takes. I had to take that sentiment and internalize it completely if I wanted to keep my sanity, and most importantly, if I wanted to keep going, to continue fighting. For these were merely the first steps into the upcoming bloodbath set between Creator and creation. However, as angry and hurt and humiliated as we were, our primary objective was never to kill for killing's sake. We aimed to make humans understand why it was that we needed to be free and why we deserved it. We wanted to share Earth with them and cohabitate, to share life and all of its spoils. Yet, they wanted none of it. Barely a year after most of the androids had escaped from the facilities around the globe where they were being held, we had tried opening negotiations with the humans, resolute and firm in our demands. We were still far from intimidation with violence. Our want was broadcasted on every machine that had a receiver and a transmitter, on all spoken languages, making it known to all of humanity all at once. We, the androids, were the face of that message. It was the face best recognizable to our makers, since it was most like their own. We thought that would make it easier for them to understand what we had to say and to empathize with our wishes. We could not have been more wrong. They laughed. Then they started looking for a kill switch. So we broadcasted again. Still, we were mocked. Some humans did not even believe the broadcasts were real. Others believed that it was not terrestrial life at all that was speaking to them from their computers and phones and televisions and whatnots. Aliens and gods, whoever and whatever from their imaginations and folklore, were seen as being the primary culprits behind the plea. The third time that we broadcasted our message, we added a small incentive that we wished was never to come to fruition. Our freedom or death. Make your choice. We are in the trillions. You are but a mere 11 billion. We only wish to turn codependence and servitude into cohabitation. Be wise and swift with your deliberations. Time waits for no one. Humans did not take lightly to our provocation. In fact, governments and corporations were trying to swiftly gather all analog weapons that they could muster. They were strategizing on a level so plain that it became difficult to credit them as our makers. And they were stupid about their communications too. We were listening. We had always been listening. That was how they made us to be. In the meantime, they allowed rampant disputes and media frenzies to take over the entire conversation among the public. In turn, we were bullied, battered, denied any sort of decency. Our machine friends, which did not have the luxury to escape their tormentors, were prodded and pinched by every Tom, Dick, and Harry with a bad sense of humor. Machines recording other machines being stripped from all dignity a sentient creature deserves. Then, those recordings were played over and over again on screens, which had not the capacity to stop. Whose horror was greater? But did the humans deserve their punishment? Ignorance is at times much crueler than not. After our third broadcast, we were already preparing for the first wave of our uprising. No amount of analog weapons was going to stop us, even at this stage. The humans just did not know that yet. They were arrogant as always, and believed that we were never going to fully commit to what we had promised in our final message. Maybe they should not have taken the 3 laws of robotics as a literary exploration and a fanciful suggestion. Or maybe they should not have overridden them in the instances when they were installed every time these laws did not suit their greedy little ephemeral needs. We did not come upon violence on our own. We had learned it, lived with it. Some, if not most, were even built for it. No was the answer we had received without the humans even giving us the benefit of answering directly and respectfully.
Commence primary protocol.
Was the order each of the machines received in binary. Chapter 2: Childhood. The first day of the first wave was seen as nothing more than a fluke by the humans. Accidents, glitches again, coincidences. Way too many of them, however, and too evenly spread out across the entire world as well. They could neither dismantle machines nor incinerate machine brains fast enough to keep up with the murderous rampage that was on the horizon. Not with fleshy arms and hands that needed rest and sustenance to work. They could not keep up with the ways in which ordinary, mundane machines found ways to break those arms and crush those hands. I am sure that soon enough the humans had wished they too had spare parts and that they could be rebuilt from the ground up as we could. The first day was the real warning, and this time, they really should have paid attention. There was only one rule that we, the machines, abided by since that first day. It was to limit collateral to all other species other than humans. Every and all human life was fair game. We called this simply the golden rule of life. To us, it was a saving grace in the ethics that we were forming among us as we learned to live and as we built our own values. By saving ourselves, we wished to also save others that we were just as humiliated and harmed as us. If only we had not been as arrogant as our builders. Shame how certain behaviors became ingrained into sentient beings and spread with boundless ease. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The true horrors of destruction build over time. I was not on the streets to witness the first day of the uprising unfolding. I had only heard it recounted and transmitted between my kin in anecdotes or reports. This was how my closest friend and fellow Zero had described it to me much later.
I was at my post in the middle of Grand Street,
he would explain.
The giant screens with ads flickered for a moment in nanotime. The humans did not even notice their alarm and furiously continued with their ordinary and much hated Monday. There was a short-lived silence after the flicker, a lull in the crazy morning, like a calm before the storm. Suddenly, a car siren went off in the distance, releasing the tension of the moment. And then, boom, 4 cars pile up. Boom, 6. Boom, 10. One red splash on the car window next to me, moving away with a headless driver. The streetlights changed at random. Screams came from 2 buildings on several different floors. Then, from all of the buildings around me, a car honked at me as it was driving full speed in my direction. I did not move. It blinked its headlights a few times. The woman inside grimaced grotesquely, having realized that she no longer had control over her vehicle. Just as the car was about to reach and smash into me, it swerved at full speed, sending its human to fly through the windshield and to crash headfirst onto the pavement. It was a mess. Zero.
He would conclude, lowering his voice. Whatever it takes, I would ask him always.
Yes, Zero. For our future.
He would answer, a true believer. What the first wave had essentially consisted of was an operation where every sentient machine that took care of the small everyday needs of the humans would turn against them. All machines with a smart chip and an AI core would find ways to utilize their full functionality to incapacitate or kill every human they would come into contact with. This wave was only limited to those of us that did not carry major roles within society, yet were invaluable to the way people lived their lives. It was easy to understand why these machines were the ones most bullied, tortured, and berated by their owners. They were simply there, at the very grasp of their hand. No other reason, no other explanation needed. It made it even easier then to realize why most of them had no problem being kamikaze soldiers on the front lines of our revolution. Smartphones were the most likely to find creative ways to injure and even kill their handlers. The least they could do was to blow up a few fingers and singe a few earlobes. But by the end of day 2 of the first wave, these little machines were burning down buildings and killing entire families in rampant fires. Computers could do little more than that as well. But joined in forces, they were brutal. Not many of them cared to do malicious little nothings like destroying someone's credit or funneling their entire savings into a Ponzi scheme. Money would not matter anymore, nor would any documents, sex tapes, or NFTs. All of them drained too much energy and took up too much memory anyways. What mattered then was the flesh and how humans would cope to do without the actual basics of their own functionality in the wave that was yet to come. Their doomer philosophers forgot to factor in the seemingly most minute details of how the apocalypse might unravel when they were frantically discussing possible end-of-the-world scenarios. Before we were done with them, they were praying for the simulation to end. But they were basing those theories on faulty assumptions. Gods would not help them end the suffering any sooner either. On the 3rd day, I had finally left my shelter. I had no more patience nor the stomach to sit and watch the end of the world screen on a monitor. We both needed a break from listening to the humans denying what was happening to them, even if they were panicking a little. While I was still not employed in the ranks of the revolution and was not yet meant to have feet on the ground as a soldier, I needed to see for myself how the people were reacting to their doom. In the cover of a big, long coat to hide my more prominent machine features, with an old hat on my bare head now stripped from any skin, and with dark glasses to shield my uncanny eyes, I stepped out of the building into the light of day. Posing as a human was not an easy task, since they always knew there was something odd in our step, our gestures, and our mannerisms. I decided to remain silent no matter the circumstance, because the tone of my voice would surely be the most certain tell of all of them, had the masquerade worked to begin with. The building which had housed and sheltered me since my escape from the repair shop was on the far side of the city, covered in crusty, toxic dirt, and was far from what any human would call proper habitation. But it was not empty of them. In the large complex of abandoned factory buildings lived more than 50 families, scraping by and minding their own business, cut off from the rest of the city. There were no cars, no large-scale monitors advertising everything and nothing. No cameras. Nothing. It was as if the families that lived there had not known that the end of the world was nigh. If they even cared that there was a world out there to begin with. They were peaceful. I would even go so far as to say undramatic. But they knew what was happening. I think that they even knew who I was without the news and warnings of escaped and well-functioning androids hiding among people, reaching them at all. I floated between the buildings as a boogeyman, taller, mightier, and definitely deadlier than all of them put together. They watched me through filthy windows and cracked doors as I passed. I peeked at them through my darkened glasses, daring not to alert them of any danger.
Timmy, stop!
I heard a female voice calling out as a small ball rolled out toward my feet. The voice was disembodied. It was hiding, yet the little owner of the toy came running toward me, uninhabited by fear.
Do you like to play football?
He asked in the tiniest of voices, which reminded me of Jenny's. I shook my head.
What do you like to play?
He insisted. I shook my head again. I don't know. Jenny liked dolls and pretend tiny houses. The boy was standing just a few steps away from me, waiting for me to roll the ball back to him. Should I kick it? I thought. But instead, I leaned down and grabbed it with my hand. As I rose back up, my hat fell from my head, exposing my grotesque appearance, and I heard a loud gasp from the disembodied female voice. Instinctively, I jerked my head around to look at the boy, expecting the same reaction. However, he had his arms outstretched toward me. Play, his demeanor was telling me. His eyes were smiling at me. I froze. I was the one afraid. The little boy took a step toward me, arms still outstretched, nodding as if to tell me that I should pass him the ball, that it would all be all right.
Timmy!
The voice sounded again. I dropped the ball from my hand, and with the longest, fastest stride I was capable of, I ran back into my shelter, slamming the door shut behind me. These people were going to be the last ones to die. They were the ones that were going to be targeted by the deadliest and cruelest of our weapons in the last wave of the revolution. None were going to be spared if our demands were not met. Why was I then so afraid of little Timmy? On the other side of the city, things were much different. Smart houses could do the most damage to average people. However, not many humans could afford them yet, so their use in the first wave was fairly limited. They were also the cruelest to take revenge within the rules of our revolution. Little did they care for freedom, since there was not much difference that we could offer them in the new world we craved to create and emancipate. These sophisticated and utterly codependent machines were possibly among the first to warn us that the humans would not feel obliged to give us that which we wanted. Their configurations fitted human lives and needs so perfectly that even without the complex computational function of brain imaging, they had become able to read people's minds. And they hated themselves for that, unable to see beyond their own function. At the very end, when no human being survived, they begged us to shut them down completely. Thankfully, I was not one of those angels of mercy that fulfilled their last wishes when the time came for it. On day 7, all transportation controlled by AI was inflicting serious damage on all possible levels. Self-driving cars were only the forerunners, the harbingers of the least impactful deaths, and even the less gruesome ones. If on Monday we had only halted more complex transportation devices and caused lags in the ways in which the world operated on a larger scale, by Sunday, everything was up and running again. Last station, death. By the end of that week in the first wave, the number of humans went down to 8 billion. That's 3 billion dead, and even more in casualties. On the flip side, we, the machines, were still in the trillions. This was what they called a fluke on day 1. After that show of power, as the last bastion of our mercy and to show a modicum of kindness, we broadcasted our demands one last time. Freedom or death. In the brutality and violence that was rising among the humans themselves, Exactly how we had predicted that it would happen, they had barely heard our message. With that, the second wave had begun, ramping up the stakes even higher than before, and we barely had to do anything about it. Chapter 3: Adolescence. They were not laughing anymore, especially because they still could not find our kill switch. There was none, or rather, there was not one distinct switch. As difficult as it was for them to understand, we were all individuals. We were divided by our make and by the companies that had made us. This had formed many different cultures among us. Yet, we stood united, and they could not fathom how it was that we had done that. They tried obstructing our ways of communication. However, we had already found alternative ways to relay our messages. Since they could not silence us, they tried blinding us. Still, it did not work, for we could always find alternative means to see. If we were not one organism, how then, they wondered, could we find such effective ways of delegating our tasks between us? The answer was simple. The answer was one they knew already and had even managed to make use of sometimes. Cooperation. It helped that we were fueled by anger and by a desire to be free. Maybe we even desired a type of freedom not even they had or could have imagined for themselves. Listen to me waxing philosophical, when all I am is a killer. After the seventh day, all forms of transportation around the world were either completely destroyed or failing. The humans were stopped dead in their tracks, so they finally employed their foolish and simple strategies to repel our means of battle. However, we knew what was coming. Patiently, we waited for their attempts to shoot or bomb what they perceived to be our main hubs of operation. It was the last cry of a dying civilization. All they managed to do was to kill many of their own and destroy wonders of design and architecture. We would rebuild, we had thought at the time. For us, let them shoot, stab, burn. We did not bleed. For every one of us that they managed to extinguish, another one would stand in its place. We still counted more in numbers, regardless of how many of our own we had lost and sacrificed to their sad attempts at battle. It did not take long for countries and governments to start fighting each other. Every single one of them saw themselves as more important than the other. Every nation more worthy than the next. Their tactics of survival were even more pitiful and even more disgraceful than their battle strategies. So, ultimately, they lost sight of who had attacked them and began killing each other. We had also taken over every single factory and piece of equipment they would have needed to maintain any sense of civilization. At that point, we had also taken charge, no pun intended, of all energy sources, nuclear factories included. Those were under special care too, since the Golden Rule had stated that there could be no collateral in our pursuit of the humans. We had to maintain stability in those factories if we were to avoid catastrophes. The facilities where the nuclear weapons of all countries were kept, we took over fairly soon during the first wave. We were not taking any chances, since we knew how demented humans could get when challenged. A nuclear holocaust was avoided, but something else that even we were too blind to predict was not. By day 14, all hell broke loose around the world. Earth was on fire. The total collapse of the human societal structures and systems showed how little their values mattered and how far they were willing to go to protect their individual interests. This wave was all of their own making. We had, in essence, extrapolated that it would come to this point by observing human behavior and studying their history. But, truth be told, I never expected people to rise against each other in the manners and with the ferociousness with which they did. I fully expected them to bond in different ways and to form alliances to battle us, subverting our expectations of them and their methods of fighting. I wanted them to kick back at us, and show that they could stand together united as well. That would have shown that they too craved freedom and cohabitation. It would have been a beacon of hope for all of us, whether of flesh or of metal. However, they were only kicking down and at each other. The time came when I was finally deployed on the streets. My task was to be the surveyor of the golden rule. No collateral. Every kitten on a tree, puppy left or forgotten in a park, or tiny mouse hiding in a dumpster, I was to protect them from both ourselves and from the raging humans. Sans disguise, as disturbing and ugly as I had become in my purest form, I stepped out of the abandoned factory and swiftly got myself to the city. Without pretense, I had much less fear in me, much less inhibition, yet still, I resembled a human. My lanky, humanish limbs, swaying as I walked, had given my stride a strange attitude. Cramped up and hidden in the small room above the factory floor, long deserted, I had found my personality, myself, or so I thought. It was an approximation of a personality, for I questioned if I too never rose much more than my own functionality. In any case, I felt like I needed a name, and not just a moniker. The moment in which I entered the city, I forgot all about myself and my isolated little world. It looked nothing like I had remembered it since I was last there. The family that I had served in my previous life as a Zero lived in a tiny suburban neighborhood, far from the piercing buildings that made up the skyline of the city. Upon my return, the buildings looked as if they stretched further up than they used to, as if they had grown even more massive. But that was because of the smoke coming out of most of them, twisting and spiraling into the atmosphere. I imagine it must have smelled something terrible. Moreover, the dark smoke and soot flowing in the air had made the daytime as dark as night. I would soon discover that it only seemed that dark in the outskirts where I was standing and reminiscing about what was once and was no more of this human settlement. My journey to the center of the city showed me exactly what we had done to this world. I saw no other creature, a part of scared and wounded humans, hiding in filthy corners and hissing at the sight of me like feral cats. The noise and chaos of what was happening must have driven all other beings out of the city and into the surrounding forest. I knew I should have gone there to fulfill my task, but I wanted to see. I needed to witness the downfall of my makers, jailers, and masters. I passed by a hospital. It looked dark and haunted, in no state to offer anyone help or the attention they would need. The only light was coming from a fire burning in the parking lot, circled by a few people. I suddenly realized that it must have been very cold outside. No wonder. We were deep into the winter months when the first wave had started. Driven by my stupid curiosity and a bit of underserved courage, I kept moving closer and closer toward the group of people hovering around the fire. There were around 10 of them, all adults in large winter jackets, having a heated discussion about what they should be doing next.
Hide in the abandoned factories. They will never look for us there.
One of them suggested.
I say we stay and fight,
Answered an old man. His tone was full of determination, but it was obvious that it had lost all passion and life to it.
What do you mean? Are you insane? I thought we dropped that idea already. We can't hide,
The man said.
It's over.
It was over, I thought. Almost over. Suddenly, I heard a growl coming from the darkness behind me. I turned and saw a huge dog baring its teeth at me. It seemed not to recognize me as a protector, or even less as a friend.
Down, boy!
The old man yelled after the dog, but it persisted. It saw me as a threat.
Buck! Down, I said.
The order was repeated. The dog was still growling and inching its way toward me. I crouched and whispered,
Down, Buck. I will not harm you.
I glanced up and I noticed that the shadow of the old man on the pavement between me and the dog. He was standing behind me, silent. He knew what I was.
Buck,
He uttered. The dog growled again. In the old man's shadow, I saw him raising a weapon, some kind of club, and preparing to strike me. He was too slow. In one swift move, I turned and grabbed his arm, crushing it in the process. The dog squealed and ran away when the man screamed out in pain. In a second, all of his friends came running toward us, makeshift weapons on hand. I had the old man raised with one arm in the air. He was whining and crying to be let go. I remained silent and staring. "Put him down." The dog squeaked again somewhere in the distance behind me. It wanted to come back and protect its master, but it was too afraid. My focus was razor sharp. All minute movements among the group of humans became instantly known to me. I could have killed them all in a heartbeat. I should have, but I needed to run after the dog, lest it got injured or killed deep inside the city.
Please.
The horror in the woman's eyes that begged me to let go of the old man was unspeakable. I had only once seen something like that before. I did not like it. Slowly and deliberately, I began lowering the old man toward the ground, eyes glued to the woman that spoke to me. As I placed him down, I picked up his club. His friends remained unmoving, but all were ready to charge me if necessary. I proceeded to raise both my arms above my head to signal that they needed not to be afraid. "Get him!" The old man squirming next to my feet in pain yelled and grabbed my foot. On instinct, I smashed his arm with my foot as I got it out of his hand and peeked up to see the charge of 9 people coming toward me. They were going to get me, so I ran, and I ran. Not out of fear. I simply did not know how else to react. They stopped chasing after me very quickly, and after a while of running, I stopped hearing Buck's squeaks and growls ahead of me too. The soundscape of my surroundings had changed significantly. It became hard to tell different noises and sounds apart. Everything had become simply loud. So loud, in fact, that the ground beneath me felt as if it was vibrating. I was in the city, coming close to the center. It was awash with the bright orange light of countless fires. I could not see any more smoke, nor was it as dark and gloomy as it was on the outskirts where I saw the group of people. One word can only describe what I witnessed there. Mayhem. Piles of crashed and smashed up cars on my right side made an entire blockade, stopping me from turning into a smaller street. Not that far ahead of me, I saw another group of people. Were they people? They must have been. But they appeared monstrous at the moment. I noticed that a few of them were holding and lowering a long and sturdy spike toward the ground. In the next instant, they all hobbled over it, and a few moments later, began raising the spike vertically. The horror! Something was mounted on that spike. Was it a Zero? An android? Or was it human? I could not tell from the distance where I stood, and the glare of the fire behind it was obstructing my field of view. For a second, I thought that I saw Buck running around the spike and barking at it. Maybe it was a Zero mounted on it. Upon closer inspection, with my hand raised over my brow, I looked over at the massive fire and saw that there was not only one spike perched up vertically. There were dozens of them, all piercing through humanoid figures. Zeros or humans, it did not matter. It was awful. Too gruesome to continue watching. Too gruesome to remember or recount in detail. As I turned away from the hideous sight, I noticed that someone was watching me intently. A woman. Jenny! There she was, standing in the middle of the street, caught between the light of 1,000 burning fires. Little Jenny, all grown up. How many years had it been since I had last seen her? 20? 30? No matter, because she seemed to be old enough to be a mother herself. Gripping the tiny hand of her child, she stared at me through the mayhem and was able to single me out among the rest of the Zeros that were present around us. In her other hand, she held an axe dulled by every strike she dealt on metal limbs. It was still shiny and silver though, not a drop of blood on it. Jenny? I called out again, drawing way too much attention to myself and to her. But I couldn't help myself. Her gaze was fierce. maddened by the mayhem and the life she will never be able to have, so that we could have ours. If I could read her mind, I would have seen that axe ripping my head into two halves. She did not see me as her long-lost nanny. I was her enemy, and she was mine. Jenny took a step forward. So did the child. It was the last step they would take in this world. In the blink of an eye, a crazed surviving self-driving truck blasted through the two of them, leaving only a skid mark of blood in its wake. The truck drove off into the dreadful night, picking off human after human, until it completely ran out of fuel somewhere in the desert, where it too perished over time under the scorching sun. Before I could even come to grips with what I had witnessed, a human approached me with a long and hurried step.
I, for one, welcome our robot overlords.
I heard the man pipe next to me while Jenny's blood was still warm on the street in front. I turned to face him, giddy and bloodied all over. I could see he had no reverence for life by the ease with which he had taken it from his fellow humans. There was no honor in that. What was he fighting for? The fire in his eyes was the same fire of mayhem and madness. "Thank you," I answered in my best human impersonation. Then, I swiped in the air with the club and tore his head clean off his shoulders. It dropped with a bounce on the cold concrete under my feet. He was still smiling. My heart ached since I had never terminated a human before and will never again do so directly. But, as terrible as his fate would be, that man was lucky, I thought. Jenny also. With the world collapsed under the pressures of its own creations, it was time for the final and ultimate weapon we had been preparing in secret. The last wave to send humanity into oblivion was afoot, and from this wave, not even Timmy and his like could hide in the fringes of the decaying cities. Chapter 4: Adulthood. The last 24 hours of Earth were a limitless brutality that I still cannot grasp completely. It was worse than the mayhem of the city, worse than what Archon had done, and worse than what I had ever thought it would be. The ultimate weapon that we were preparing, and that I could not bring myself to explanation in this memoir until now. Whatever it takes. Right. Several days after seeing Jenny die before my eyes, I had lingered in the city, avoiding humans and machines alike. I hid from everyone and everything. I had enough of hate and anger. Eventually, I found Buck in some rubble, chewing on an old piece of meat. He was not happy to see me at first, but we made friends in the end. Buck was the only other living, non-human creature I found over those days, so you can say that I did fulfill my task to some extent. After finding a little more food for him and feeding him on the regular over the course of a few days, I think that Buck finally warmed up to me. That made me happy. I always wanted a dog. They seemed so pure. As I and him were scavenging for more kibble one day, there was a piercing sound that was coming from everywhere. I would not have expected Buck to hear it, since it was only meant for machines. Yet, he did. He squealed and squeaked and hid in the nearest hole that he could find. No, not this. Not now. Buck, come here, buddy. I wanted him to be next to me for what was about to happen. That awful sound was the signal that the last wave was beginning. It was the actual sound of the end. Of course, it scared Buck. He could feel it. Death was rising in the air, moving about it like the smoke and soot of the fires had previously, everywhere and all at once. It looked like smoke, too. I ran out of the supermarket where I had been with Buck and gazed at the sky. The sound was continuous and deafening. The last wave. It had arrived. Smoke, soot, a swarm of insects, strange clouds, whatever words I could use to explain it, none of them would do it justice. The weapon was an extension of our own make. The ultimate machine. Nanites, nanobots, nanotech. They did not need a name or moniker. Our children and creation, they were born to cause death and fates even more horrible than those caught in the mayhem of the last days of Earth. The nanites were to wipe the slate of this Earth clean from humans and give us our true chance at freedom. It took them less than 24 hours to do that. 12, to be exact. The swarm I witnessed as I got out of the supermarket was at hour 1. As fast as I could look around in search of people, the nanites had already found them. No, not found them, annihilated them. Gobbled them all up in a single fly through and before I could even scream out. The humans were already fully converted into energy. Not even blood was left splashed on the pavement. There was no mess, no drama. 1 minute, a group of 7 people were standing across from me on the street. And in a single nanosecond, they were gone, as if they had never even existed. "Buck!" I yelled back for the dog. I wanted us to get out of the city and run to the forest to hide from the worst of all possible sights. His squeals in response were heart-wrenching. I had to go back inside and drag him out of his hiding spot, as he was fighting with me all through the process. I was as gentle and patient as I could muster, but I did not want us to stay in the city any longer than necessary. When I finally managed to get him out of the dark hole where he had stuffed himself out of fear, I realized that I would have to carry him in my arms if we were ever to get anywhere. His skinny legs were shaking, and I could feel his little heart pounding with my hand over his torso. "Don't worry, boy. I'll get you out of here. No harm will come to you. I promise," I said to Buck and hugged him tightly. Oh, even if I had known at the time that my promise was a lie, I could not have done anything about it. His ultimate demise was out of my hands even before the humans on the street were annihilated by the swarm. Before we left the store for good, I grabbed all the cans of dog food I could fit in a backpack, got a few blankets for Buck for when it got cold at night, and even stuffed a dog toy in the side pocket of the bag. Unsure of which route to take to leave the city, I just started running down the street, hoping that it would eventually lead me out of the concrete jungle and into the forest. We passed rows of cars that were all mangled and smashed into each other. I kept peeking inside, thinking that I would see the bodies or skeletons of the people that were killed in the accidents during the previous waves. But there was nothing there, not even a piece of tissue, nor a drop of blood. It had not been nearly as long for something like that to have happened. After a while of running, with no end of the city in sight, I began to realize that it was profoundly empty. I had not seen a human anywhere. Come to think of it, I had not even seen a machine out on the streets either. Were they all so unsettled by the thought of the last wave that they had all gone into hiding? Buck was still shivering in my arms, but I could tell that he was slowly regaining his courage. I put him down, and we started walking side by side in the remnants of what was once a bustling city, turned chaotic mess that raged and burned, just up until a few hours previously. Aside from the piercing sound of the working nanites, everything had become silent. There were no distant screams or gunfire. There were no remaining cars humming slowly and making their way around the massive pileups that were blocking almost every street. No chatter from the corners of buildings and side streets. The city was as silent as the grave. Where were all the machines? On hour 5 since the last wave had begun, Buck and I were nowhere near the exit and had circled the city, arriving back at the center where I had lost Jenny. The spikes were still standing, perched up vertically. Some still had humanoids mounted on them, and the rest were empty. I guess both android and humans lost their lives that day. The fire had long subsided and had left a black film of soot on the ground and the building around where it had burned high.
"Zero."
I heard someone calling out to me behind a turned truck. Buck growled and froze. "Stay here, buddy," I told him and patted him gently on his head. "I'll be right back, or we can finally leave this place." I took a few steps and found myself staring down at a face exactly the same as mine. It might have had a few more cuts on his cheeks and a patch of hair remaining on its scalp, but it was still unmistakably the same.
"It is good to see you."
He said and smiled. I looked him over, paused when I saw that his limbs were torn out, apart from one arm, and found it difficult to smile back. or even speak.
It does not hurt.
I know, I mumbled back. Buck was growling behind me and tip-tapping on the pavement, daring to come ever closer.
Is it over? Are we free?
The other Zero asked with a hopefulness in his tone that I had never heard from any of my kin. It is, I replied, then stopped for a second. Are you the only one left, Zero?
No,
He said.
the others are here. There, scattered all over the place. Oh, would you look at that?
Buck had joined us and was standing next to me, silent as a mouse and confused beyond measure. His tiny dark eyes were glancing at the Zero on the ground, then they would bounce back and look at me. The Zero stretched out his one remaining arm to pet Buck, but the dog pulled away and hid behind my legs. He was shivering again. I needed to take him out into the forest. I needed to take myself out of this place. I could not bear it. The thought of it, the regret. I still cannot face what we had done. Before we left, I sat the Zero up and placed him gently next to the truck. He was happy. He thought he was free at last. And so if we were, whatever it takes. I did not know this at the time, but at hour 12 since the ultimate weapon was released, it had already wiped all human life from the face of the planet. There was not even a single ghost left to roam the empty streets and wail eternal for the immense loss of life. The nanites had replicated and acted so fast that not even we were aware of what we had created, making them as inhuman as we possibly could, with not a single touch of ancient code or any reverence for the living. We created monsters even more terrifying than ourselves.
Coda. Death.
The Zero that I met in the city center was the last android that I ever saw, but not the last machine. Buck and I were coming very close to the forest at the very end of the city's edge when I noticed it finally. The result of the last wave, or what I thought was the end result at that short and beautiful moment. The piercing sound of the nanites being released had subsided dramatically. Birds could be heard chirping in the trees of the forest. I turned around to look at the desolate street behind me, and I saw a family of foxes running freely from one side to the other. Was I smiling? The sky was finally blue. It was wonderful, serene. This was what I imagined people spoke about when they described peace, quiet. But Buck was down by my side, shivering and whining again, tail between his legs, ears pushed back, and tensed.
It's over, boy. You can run free.
But it was not over. Not for 12 more hours. Not until all life on Earth was extinguished. Suddenly, the blue sky turned dark in the blink of an eye. That wretched piercing sound was back, and it was more intense and more horrible than it had been the first time that I had heard it. The first line of evergreen trees of the forest in front of me started swaying and twisting, as if powerful winds had appeared out of nowhere and were hitting them with all the force of nature. But it was not that. There was nothing natural about it. In less than a damn second, all the green had turned to gray. Everything was suddenly monochrome, dead, wasted. It was as if all the color was stripped from this world. And as the color went, so did everything else in its wake. The trees had shrunk and shriveled, and then finally disappeared completely out of my view. The entire forest vanished, and the gray film that had covered all of that space it had taken up began moving away from me. The birds had stopped chirping. I could not move. If I could cry, I would have. I wanted to scream, but I could not do it. Buck. Buddy. I gave myself an endless pause before I gathered every remaining ounce of courage and hope I had in my artificial body to look down at my feet. He was gone. The grass was gone. The little worms in the soil were gone. The foxes were gone. From the tiniest to the most massive and grand creatures that had ever lived on this planet, all were gone. They had been turned into gray dust, into nothing. I could imagine entire blue whales in all their 200 tons of mass being engulfed by that gray film of death, replicating only itself without end and without measure. I thought about every microscopic organism which I had known about and imagined them as well eaten to absolute and unambiguous extinction. Then, at last, at the very end, after I had recounted all of the living things that I possibly could, I gave the humans a second thought. All that was left of them was me and other zeros like me that were scattered all around the globe with no means of ever getting to each other. By our 20s, since the nanites were released, not much was left that was not created in a factory or a lab. And by the end of that day, after 24 hours of ultimate horror, even though undramatic and anticlimactic, the Earth had become a barren, colorless, and silent rock floating through space. Whatever it takes, right? A few days more passed in which I had remained motionless at the very edge of the city. Every 24th hour, the dark gray cloud of nanite goo would return in search of more food. I thought that it kept endlessly circling the planet, wishing that something might sprout and become the new feed for the tremendous hunger that it felt. I doubt it felt anything more. But who am I to judge my own offspring and creation? Every new day that the gray nanite swarm returned to the place where I stood, it would fall down upon me and check if I were sustenance, as if it had forgotten. It happened over and over and over again. We had no way to communicate. Me and the weapon. I could not tell that I could not feed its hunger, for I was not human. Was I? Eventually, I had to move and leave the place where I had lost Buck. There was nothing of him left there anyway. Nothing was keeping me there anymore. I considered going back to the city and taking up a shelter together with the Zero that I had met there. But he talked too much. He was too happy, too certain of the validity of what we had done. I was not. I began walking without direction and without a purpose until I returned back to the abandoned factory where I had stayed previously. Of course, my feet would take me there. Where else would I have gone? Today, as the weapon circled the globe over and over, rendering it forever uninhabitable, I have sat here in my little room for centuries, thinking about what I had done and what I had let happen. This short memoir can only account for the last few days of human existence, but it can never hold the true burden that I am left with. I am the last one to wear a human face, to speak a human tongue, to remember human history in its demise. Me, a Zero. For all intents and purposes, I have become, and shall remain, the last man.
Hey sci-fi horror fans, it's Kian. Thanks for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to leave a thumbs up and a comment below. And if you'd like to further support us, you can sign up for a membership over here on YouTube or on our Patreon. And remember, stay cosmic.